Hello, my friends. Lots of beginning and intermediate Scrum Masters put a great deal of emphasis on the process of story pointing product backlog items. They run their development teams through exercises like planning poker. They calculate velocity. They do burn down charts based on story points, all with the idea that what they're doing is measuring what the team is able to produce. And as I say, that's what beginning intermediate Scrum Masters do, but more advanced ones start to say to themselves, there's something wrong. There's something wrong with this picture. It doesn't make sense. And I'm here to tell you that those people are right. Story points do not make sense, at least the way they're being used right now. And let me see if I can explain that. By the way, my name is Fred Fowler. I'm a third-level Professional Scrum Master certified by Scrum.org, a PSM3. I've been doing Scrum for 20 years, and I've worked for companies big and small, and I've taught about 300 people how to be Scrum Masters or product owners. And through all that time, I keep running into user stories, story points, and keep trying to correct people's misunderstanding of them, which unfortunately is very easy to misunderstand what they are. So anyway, just to go over what story points are nominally, the whole idea is that the developers assign story point values to product backlog items based on how big those product backlog items are, how much time and effort it will require to fill the needs that are identified in the product backlog items. And then you can calculate a team's velocity by adding up the story point totals of the product backlog items that are successfully delivered during a sprint. And so you come up with a statistic for a team that says, well, they can do like 50 story points per sprint. And that velocity, some people assume that if a team starts doing better, if they get more used to working together, that they get the hang of working together, that the story point count that they deliver will go up. In other words, increasing story points and increasing velocity is a measure of the team's success, their maturity, their ability to get things done. Those are all the so-called truisms about story points. And if you become an experienced Scrum Master, you start to realize that none of that makes much sense. Story points are not really a measure of a team's productivity. And increasing velocity, the increasing number of story points per sprint, has no bearing on whether the team is really performing well or not. And so let me see if I can explain what's going on and why people get the wrong impression about story points. Story points were originally conceived of as a way to let a team measure its capacity. You see, Scrum is based on empirical process control, which means that decisions need to be made based on measured facts as opposed to opinions or guesses. And so what you need to do is be able to measure things. And one of the most important things to measure is just what can a team, what can they deliver, how well can they perform on a sprint-by-sprint basis. Now, who needs to know how well a team performs? Well, obviously the product owner, since the product owner is kind of an investor and needs to know whether the money that's being invested in the team's salaries is actually producing something of value worthwhile. But the teams themselves need to know, because they need to make decisions about how much challenge to take on sprint by sprint. And so when you're in a sprint planning meeting, which is where the product owner and the developers discuss the product backlog and agree on a scope for work in the next couple weeks, the developers need some way to figure out how much is too much or how much is enough. So they need to figure out for each product backlog item just how much of their capacity it will require in order to deliver. So anyway, that's where user story points were born, out of the need for the developers to be able to make some kind of way to measure the size of product backlog items and the effort involved in delivering those things, so that they can make decisions about what to take on and what not to take on a sprint-by-sprint basis. Now, story points are arbitrary values. In other words, they are things that the developers assign based on whatever criteria they want to use. And usually the way it works is that story points, you look at a particular product backlog and say, well, that's pretty big, and this other one is smaller, and this other one is even smaller, but this other one is the biggest one of all. So you end up with a range of values going from small to large. So story points really are a reflection of relative complexity. How much more complex something is than something else. And by the way, there is no yardstick that can be used to look at a product backlog item and calculate exactly how many so-called story points it is. These are just guesstimates based on developers' experience and their gut feel for whether something is bigger or smaller than something else. So anyway, the story pointing process is unique for each development team. And there are tools like planning poker, which in effect allow a team to work together to come up with one number that represents in their best estimate how big and complex a product backlog item is. And we'll talk about planning poker in a different video. We'll assume that you know what planning poker is, because most people do. So that's really why story points exist. They're just as a guide to developers to give them a handle on what they should say yes to during a sprint planning meeting and what they should say no to. Yes, we can do that. It looks like we have capacity to do that, but no, we can't do that one as well. That's too much. So that's where user story points started, but unfortunately they have been completely co-opted to try to mean things that they don't mean at all. One of the biggest common misconceptions is that a story point for one team is the same as a story point for another team. So what that means is that some management people assume that you can take the velocity of one team and compare it to the velocity of another to figure out which one is doing a better job. Well, this team is doing 50 story points, but that one over there is doing 60 story points, so they must be doing better. Well, that is completely wrong, misunderstanding what story points are and how they work. And if you don't believe me, just remember that story points are assigned by the developers themselves. So if a development team does normally 50 story points per sprint, they have a velocity of 50 story points, and some manager says, yeah, I expect you to double that. I expect you to have 100 story points per sprint. You got to work harder, 100 story points. All the developers have to do is just take all of their estimates and double them. So all of a sudden 50 story points turns into 100 story points for the same amount of result. So the whole idea that story points somehow are equivalent of product produced is completely wrong. Now there's another misunderstanding about story points, that they really are the same thing as man hours, man days. And that's wrong too, because if you have a team of 5 people and they work for 10 days, which is a standard 2-week sprint, then how many man days is it? Well, 5 people, 10 days, 50 man days. And so the team has 50 man days worth of resource available. Now, if you estimate how much work you can do in terms of man days, and then try to measure the team's velocity, well, the velocity would be always 50 man days, because that's how much resource you have when you calculate based on time. So trying to calculate velocity based on man days is simply saying, well, how many man days worth of work can be done in 50 man days? 50 man days worth of work can be done in 50 man days. And so, in effect, the velocity in that situation is meaningless. It doesn't tell you anything. And of course, generally speaking, velocity doesn't tell you much of anything anyway. Now, there are lots of different ways to calculate velocity. There's different ways of doing planning poker. One of the most insidious problems with planning poker and velocity is the scale that is used to calculate story points. Now, there are some scales that are used, like for instance, T-shirt sizes, which make a lot of sense. This is a big one, there's a small one, that's extra large, this is extra small. And so basically you're giving intuitive size values to different product backlog items. And then when you're calculating velocity, how many story points can be done by a team during a sprint, you say, well, we did 3 extra larges, 2 mediums, and a small. So that means next time around, we shouldn't really estimate that we'll do more than 3 extra larges, 2 mediums, and a small. And that's okay. Now, the real fallacy comes in when you start using numerical values for story points. One very popular numerical scale for story points is the Fibonacci series. So it's the numbers like 2, 3, 5, 8, 13. Basically, you take 2 numbers, add them together, that gives you the next one in the series. And they seem to be convenient because the Fibonacci series, basically the numbers get farther apart as they get bigger. So you don't really have to worry about the difference between a 12 or a 13, but you can intuitively get the difference between a 13 and a 21, which is the next one in the series. So that's all well and good, but the problem, the fallacy comes in when somebody assumes that you can add these numbers together, that they're related by arithmetic. So the mistake comes when somebody says, well, we got a 3, we also have a 5, but the other one, that one's an 8, so we can do the 8 or we can do the 3 and the 5. That's assuming a relationship that doesn't really exist. There's nothing that says that a 3 and a 5 put together equal an 8. All that those numbers say is that the 8 is bigger than the 5, which is bigger than the 3. And they don't say by how much. So when somebody says, well, our team does 75 story points per sprint using the Fibonacci series, that has no meaning at all, because what is actually made up of that 75 story points? There's no arithmetic relationship between the different parts of that. It's much better to do something like a T-shirt, because at least that's less ambiguous. There's no assumption that in T-shirts that 2 mediums are the same as 1 large. No such assumption like that exists. It's all kind of arbitrary and gut feel. So anyway, to make a long story short, it's kind of too late for that. It's already a long story. People put a lot of emphasis on story points estimation, calculating velocity, but none of that really matters. It doesn't matter what a team's velocity is, because you can't use that velocity in any meaningful way. What does matter? How much value does the team produce? And that's actually something you can measure. You can measure the value of the team's work based on the value of the results that they produce. And there's a whole nother video about that. But the point is, that's something that is actually verifiably measurable. Because you can always measure the value of a piece of software by selling it. If you sell a piece of software, the customers will tell you how valuable it is based on how much they're willing to pay. So you have a standard unit of measure, which is money, and you have an objective way to measure that value, where there's no such way to objectively measure the size of something, the story point value. So in the end, the lesson here is, don't worry about story points, don't worry about velocity. The only purpose of those things is to help the developers make decisions about what they're going to try to get done during a sprint. And by the way, if they try to get stuff done in the sprint and they don't, if they make a bad decision, that doesn't really matter. It isn't important how closely these people can estimate things. What matters is how much do they actually produce. There's one experienced friend of mine who says that his standard for success or not is whether the team delivers at least 90% of what they estimated they were going to deliver. And you know what? That sounds good, but it begs the question of what's the value of what they're delivering? You have to remember that the whole reason for having a development team is to create something of value whose value can be realized. And if you're not creating something of value in a way that can be measured, then why are you doing it? Because you're spending money to pay these people to do that. And there's no amount of story point stuff that will actually make sense in terms of figuring out whether a team is producing something valuable or not. So forget about story points. Don't beat yourself up about how to make the story points accurate. Estimating doesn't matter. What does matter is what is actually produced, and that's measurable. So anyway, thanks a lot for your time and effort. That's the end of this story. If you like this, please give it a like. If you want more, please feel free to subscribe. And by the way, you love comments. Please send more comments if you have any questions or comments, or tell me I'm all crazy or something like that. I don't care. I'm interested to know what you want to say. So again, I want to say thank you very much for your time and effort. Thank you for helping me explore the world of Scrum in the real world. Best regards.